Chapter 7 is called Auditing Internal Control over Financial Reporting. So Section 404 of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act requires management of publicly traded companies to issue a report that accepts responsibility for establishing and maintaining adequate internal control over financial reporting and to assert whether that control is effective as of the end of the fiscal year. Remember, this is one of the big takeaways from Sarbanes-Oxley is that all components of, or I should say, even the non-financial managers are having to accept quite a bit more responsibility in terms of the financials. So management must comply with the following requirements in order for the external auditor to complete an audit of the ICFRs. So basically the internal controls for financial reporting. Accept responsibility for the effectiveness of the entity's ICFR, evaluate the effectiveness of that ICFR using suitable control criteria, support the evaluation with sufficient evidence, including any applicable documentation, and present a written assessment regarding the effectiveness of the entity's ICFR as of the end of the entity's most recent fiscal year. All right, so the entity's independent auditor must audit and report during the audit process on the effectiveness of these internal controls. That is accomplished through what's known as an integrated audit, which basically just means during the audit process, make sure you're taking a look at the internal controls for financial reporting. ICFR is defined as a process designed to provide reasonable assurance regarding the reliability of financial reporting in the preparation of financial statements in accordance with GAAP. Controls include procedures that 1. Pertain to the maintenance of records that accurately and thoroughly reflect the transactions and dispositions of the assets of the company, 2. Provide reasonable assurance that transactions are properly authorized and recorded in accordance with GAAP, and 3. Provide reasonable assurance regarding prevention or timely detection of unauthorized acquisition, use, or disposition of the company's assets. So a control deficiency would exist when the design or operation of an existing control does not allow management or employees in the normal course of performing their normal assigned functions to prevent or detect misstatements in a timely fashion. So again, these are vocabulary during the evaluation of internal control processes. So significant deficiency is a control deficiency or a combination of several of them in internal control over financial reporting that happens to be less severe than a material weakness, but important enough that people should pay attention to it that are in charge of the company's financials. A control deficiency may be serious enough that it is to be considered not only a significant deficiency, but also a material weakness in the overall system of internal control. A material weakness is a deficiency, combination of deficiencies in ICFR, such that there is a reasonable possibility that a material misstatement of the annual or interim financial statements would not be prevented or detected in a timely manner. As illustrated in the next slide we're going to look at, the auditor must consider 2 dimensions of the control deficiency. First is likelihood, is it reasonably possible? The second is magnitude, how serious is it going to be? Is it going to be material, significant, or overall insignificant? So material weakness must be both material in magnitude and also be reasonably possible or probable in likelihood. It should be reported extremely should be reported externally to the audit committee and to management. A significant deficiency is not material in magnitude, but is significant and is reasonably possible or probable. It should be reported to the audit committee and also management. A control deficiency is neither material nor significant in magnitude. Its likelihood is reasonably possible or probable. It should be reported to management. Management must follow a top-down risk-based approach where 1, they identify financial reporting risks and controls, 2, consider which locations to include in the evaluation, and 3, evaluate evidence about the operating effectiveness of ICFR. Most entities use the framework that the entity COSO has developed. The framework identifies 3 primary objectives of internal control. That would be 1, reliable financial reporting, 2, efficiency and effectiveness of operations, and 3, compliance with laws and regulations. Examples of entity-level controls include controls that monitor results of operations, the entity's risk assessment process, and also controls over period-end financial reporting. Table 7.1 here shows a little bit more detail from the textbook. Management must develop sufficient documentation to support its assessment of the effectiveness of internal control. This documentation may take many forms, such as paper, electronic files, or other media. It also includes policy manuals, process models, flowcharts, job descriptions, documents, and other forms. An integrated audit is composed of the audits of internal control and the financial statements. So basically, whilst doing the audit of the financial statements, taking a look at internal controls, because they are related very significantly to each other. The control testing impacts the planned substantive procedures. Also, the results of the substantive procedures are considered while doing the evaluation of the internal control, because obviously they're related. So these are the steps in the audit of internal controls related to financial reporting. Plan the ICFR audit, identify the controls to test using a top-down risk-based approach, test the design and operating effectiveness of selected controls, evaluate identified control deficiencies, and form an opinion on the effectiveness of the ICFR. And again, like always, when you see a list or a chart that flows like this, potential to need to memorize it for the CPA exam. So the planning process is similar to the process used for the audit of financial statements in general. Obviously, that's kind of a formulaic way of doing it, so it can be applied in various scenarios. Major consideration for the external auditor is how much work is to be performed by others outside of the auditor and the auditor's own firm. In determining the extent to which the auditor needs the work of others, the auditor should do all of these things: evaluate the nature of the controls that are subjected to the work of others, evaluate competence, and do some tests. As the risk associated with the control being tested increases, the external auditor should do more of the work. Excuse me. This is a top-down approach in this flow chart of the audit of an ICFR. We're going to first identify entity-level controls. Second, identify significant accounts and disclosures and their relevant assertions. Third, understand likely sources of misstatement. And fourth, select controls to test. What are some of the indicators of a significant account? Size and composition of the account, susceptibility of misstatement due to errors or fraud, volume of activity, complexity, and homogeneity. I guess that's how you say that. Homogeneity of the individual transactions, how similar are they to each other, nature of the account or disclosure, and accounting and reporting complexities associated with the account or disclosure. So basically, it's going to be an ad hoc determination on each individual account. Here's just a couple more of them listed here. Exposure to losses in the account. Possibility of significant contingent liabilities that may arise from activities reflected in the account. Existence of related party transactions. And changes from the prior period in account or disclosure characteristics. Here are some sources of misstatements. Where you, I guess where you might look or how you might discover some of these sources of misstatements. By understanding the flow of transactions related to relevant assertions, identifying points within the entity's processes at which a misstatement could arise that might be material, identifying the controls that management has implemented to address any potential misstatements, any controls management has implemented over the prevention or timely detection of unauthorized acquisition, use, or disposition of the company's assets, again, that might result in material misstatement. And you should be noticing a theme here where anything that might result in material misstatement would potentially be a source of misstatement that we need to consider. Some factors that are commonly considered when identifying controls to test include these four. Points at which, number one, points at which errors or fraud could occur. 2, the nature of the controls implemented by management. 3, the significance of each control in achieving control objectives. And 4, the risk the controls might not be operating effectively. And there's a little bit more detail there in that table, which is 7.4. I believe, yeah, 7.4 from the text. All right. So testing the design and operating effectiveness of controls. I'm going to first evaluate the design, and then test and evaluate operating effectiveness. Look at the nature, which you're going to look at through inquiry, inspection of documents, observation, and performance. Timing, when are you going to do it? Are you going to do it throughout the year or as of a certain date? And then how much you're going to look at. How thorough are you going to look at it? Look at the nature of the control, frequency of operation, and overall importance. Based on those items, that will help you determine the extent to which effectiveness needs to be tested. As discussed previously, the auditor must consider the likelihood and magnitude of the control deficiency. 7.6 from the text gives a little more detail there. The deficiency or a combination of deficiencies prevents the auditor from having reasonable assurance that transactions are recorded properly. At that point, the auditor should treat the deficiency as an indicator of material weakness, as you see here from a little bit more detail from 7.7. Remediation is the process of making corrections and material weaknesses that exist within the internal controls for financial reporting. If it's corrected before the as-of date, there must be sufficient time for both management and the auditor to test the operating effectiveness of the corrected control. If not, an adverse opinion might still be required. In addition to the management representations obtained as part of a financial statement audit, the auditor also obtains written representations from management related to the audit performed on the internal controls for financial reporting. Without getting that written representation, you basically can't put out an opinion. The auditor should properly document the processes, procedures, judgments, and results relating to the audit of internal control. Document everything. Remember, this documentation is for the auditor's own benefit. When an entity has effective controls for financial reporting, the auditor should be able to perform sufficient testing of controls to be able to assess any control risk related to the relevant assertions as being a low-level risk. The auditor's documentation of the process, procedures, judgments, and results relating to the audit of internal controls for financial reporting should generally include at least these components. Understanding and evaluation of the design of each of the components of the controls by the auditor, I should say. Process used to determine the points at which misstatements could potentially occur, or I guess I should say are most likely to occur. The extent to which the auditor relied upon the work of others, scope of testing, and then finally, evaluation of any deficiencies discovered or other findings which might warrant a report modification. So what are the types of reports relating to the audit of internal controls for financial reporting? An unqualified opinion signifies that the entity's internal control is designed and operating effectively. That is to say, there are no material weaknesses that have been discovered. A serious, which would be more than minor, scope limitation requires the auditor to disclaim an opinion, which basically means, hey, we've looked at these financials, but because of not being able to see the whole picture for whatever reason, we're not going to be able to do an opinion on it. And then an adverse opinion is required if material weakness is identified, which obviously an adverse opinion basically means we've looked at this stuff and we don't like what we're seeing. So there are two types of reports related to the audit of internal controls relating to financial reporting. When there's no deficiency, a control deficiency or a significant deficiency, then an unqualified opinion should be issued, and this is the goal, obviously. And then, of course, if there's a material weakness, an adverse opinion must be issued. And the reason you don't see a disclaimer of opinion on there, it just means that's not an opinion, right? That's not an audit report. That's you saying, I'm not going to do an audit report because of XYZ scope limitation. All right, so the report of the audit of internal controls can be modified based on the potential scope limitation. If the scope was minor, an unqualified report should be offered. If the scope limitation or the effect of not being able to see every little bit of information has more than a minor effect, then a disclaimer of opinion or withdrawal from the engagement should ensue. Some other potential reporting issues: management's report is incomplete or improperly presented. Auditor decides to refer to the report of other auditors. Significant subsequent event has occurred after the date, the as of date, I should say. There is additional information contained in management's report on internal control, and what if there's a remediated material weakness as of an interim date. So these could all result in other issues. The auditor must communicate in writing to management and the audit committee all significant deficiencies and material weaknesses identified during the audit. This communication should be made prior to the issuance of the auditor's report on internal controls for financial reporting. In addition, the auditor should communicate to management in writing all control deficiencies that have been identified during the audit process and inform the audit committee when such communication has been made. Many companies use a service organization to process transactions. If the service organization's services make up a part of a company's information system, then it is considered part of the information and communication component of the company's internal control over financial reporting. In that case, both management and the auditor must consider all the activities of the service organization related to the entity in question. Management and the auditor should perform the following procedures with respect to the activities performed by service organization. 1. Obtain an understanding of the nature and significance of the services provided by the service organization and their effect and the effect of the user entity's internal control that's relevant to the audit, sufficient to identify and assess the risks of material misstatement, and 2, design and perform audit procedures that are responsive to the risks identified in 1. Safeguarding of assets is defined as policies and procedures that provide reasonable assurance regarding prevention or timely detection of unauthorized acquisition, use, or disposition of the entity's assets that could have a material effect on the financial statements. Computer-assisted audit techniques, acronym CAT, include generalized audit software, custom audit software, and test data. Obviously, that doesn't give you a whole lot of information, but the computer-assisted auditing could almost be another class completely on its own. These are just some generic functions performed by general audit software: access file or databases, selection operators, arithmetic functions, statistical analyses, and report generation. So if you are an auditor that uses audit software, which would be most of them these days, you will have, at the very least, those types of tools and functions available to you. Now, if you've got custom audit software that's generally written by auditors, or auditors have had a say in the writing of said software for specific audit tasks. So if you have some specialized audit task that you need to do, you may have to have custom code written for it. Obviously, anything that's custom is going to be super expensive. Software, no different. And anything you have to build from scratch, obviously, taking a long time to develop is also a significant issue. Test data are developed by the auditor to test the application controls in the entity's computer programs. This technique can be used to check the data validation controls and error detection routines, process logic controls, do arithmetic calculations, and include transactions and records, files, and reports. I should say that these advanced modules components are not likely to be tested heavily on the CPA exam.